Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really great to have you here. This is a special event. I'm Tom Manley, the president of Antioch College, a position that on an afternoon such as this one, surrounded by so many guests and friends of the college and alumni, that I feel especially humbled to be talking or to be listening to a speaker such as Dr. Michael Higginbotham, and to inaugurate the Leon Higginbotham Jr. Distinguished Seminar Series. Leon Higginbotham was a graduate of Antioch College in 1949. As Barbara was saying to me right before I came up, he is truly at the apex of our pantheon. So I'm going to introduce Myla Cooper, the director of the Coretta Scott King Center at Antioch and the vice president for diversity and inclusion, and a great colleague of mine who will introduce Barbara.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're honored, the Coretta Scott King Center, to be affiliated with this inaugural event. It's a deep honor for us, and we look forward to continuing the tradition of this distinguished seminar series as we continue to increase our profile of what we do here for the campus and the community. This is a really odd tradition that we started, to have someone introduce the person who's introducing the person who's introducing the speaker. So we're going to try to be very brief, but it's also my honor to present Barbara Winslow, introduce to some and present to others. And it's especially important, I think, for the order of the program, the way it's flowing, because I represent the Coretta Scott King Center at Antioch College, and Barbara has been an integral part of the Coretta Scott King Center and very instrumental in the creation of it, and we appreciate her unparalleled support for the Coretta Scott King Center and Antioch College. And it's also appropriate for Barbara to come next to introduce this series, because she's an activist in her own right. She's a historian of women's activism, Professor Emerita of Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, having taught in their Women's and Gender Studies program, and she's the founder and director emerita of the Shirley Chisholm Project there at that college. She's dedicated her academic and professional career addressing women's issues and inequality, and she continues to be a force to reckon with, outspoken and a fiery supporter of the cause, for the cause of justice. So the Coretta Scott King Center is happy to introduce her, who will now present the speaker. Please help me welcome Barbara to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. What a beautiful day and what a wonderful reunion. On behalf of the Antioch College class of 1968, I'm particularly honored to be able to introduce not one, but two very distinguished Higginbothams, as well as to inaugurate the Antioch College Honorable A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Seminar Series. First, a word about A. Leon Higginbotham, who graduated from Antioch in 1949. He was born in New Jersey in 1928, the son of Emma Lee Higginbotham, a maid, and his father, Aloysius Leon Higginbotham Sr., so you know what the A stands for, was a factory worker. He was raised in a largely African-American neighborhood and was the first student at his small, segregated grammar school to be promoted to the traditionally all-white academic track at Ewing Park High School in New Jersey. At age 16, he was admitted to Purdue University, hoping to earn an engineering degree. At that time, Purdue's student body was comprised of approximately 6,000 white students and 12 black students. Although eligible for admission, black students were not permitted to live in the dormitories. You all know Purdue is in Pennsylvania, not Mississippi. Indiana, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. I was a history major, I wasn't a geography major. Higginbotham and the other 11 students were not permitted to live in the dormitories. Higginbotham, in a building called the International House, which was the only building that blacks could live in. While traveling as a member of Purdue's debate team, he was refused to sleep in the team's designated hotel. Again, not in the former Confederate South. This was not. Higginbotham often related the story about his seeking a meeting with the university president, then Edward C. Elliott, to ask permission so that the African-American students could sleep in a section of one of the heated dormitories. Elliott's response was purportedly, and I quote, "The law doesn't require us to put you in those dormitories. The law doesn't even require us to let you in. You take it or leave it," end quote. Higginbotham would later identify this encounter as the event that caused him to pursue a career in the law, saying, quote, "And then, even though I had been doing very well there, I decided that engineering would not make a difference in America. The most which a black person could do as an engineer is to make a better gadget, but a gadget which would not significantly do anything with oppression. So I guess on that trip back to the segregated house, I decided I would become a lawyer." He made another important decision. He transferred to Antioch College, where the only other African-American student there was Coretta Scott. While at Antioch, Higginbotham was consul president, served as the head of the college chapter of the NAACP. During a conference at Ohio State collegiate NAACP chapters, Higginbotham successfully advocated for legislation to lower the voting age to 18. He served on the college alumni board from 1954 to 1957, and then again 1963 to 1966, and was a featured speaker at many Antioch College events. I urge you to read Leon Higginbotham's self-reflective essay, one that he wrote in his senior year, published later in the 2012 Antioch Review. It is utterly fascinating, and you don't have to be a historian to be fascinated by it. It's a 46-page, this is 46 pages, single space, and you really get a sense of the brilliance and the future brilliance of this young man. I want to read two things which I think some of you will get a chuckle over. This is a quote. "4 periods on community council, NAACP, elected positions, NLRB co-op jobs, whole and communal living were significantly valuable as experiences in human relations." And that probably sounds very similar to most of us in terms of our co-op jobs, our involvement in community government, and so forth. And he put this in italics. "Of course, the charmingness of Miss Jean L. Foster, who I met, dated, and eventually married, cannot be omitted." He also wrote, quote, "Vocationally, and this was at the end, I also want a job which will offer some economic security. All of my life, I seem to have been wondering where will be found the next dollar." Now, does this sound familiar to many of you? At Antioch particularly, I've had to constantly borrow money from the loan fund and seek scholarships from either the tuition reduction or race relations fund. Presently, I owe the school more than, ready for it, $50. And do not think that my parents and I will be able to pay more than 1/2 of the tuition, room, and board for period 3. In the fall of 1949, he entered Yale Law School. As he had in grade school, he worked in a butcher shop to support himself. As a first-year student, Higginbotham worked as a research assistant to a professor who arranged for him to attend the oral arguments in Sweat v. Painter, which dealt with the admission of blacks to the University of Texas. And Michael, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's one of the cases that leads to Brown, if I'm not mistaken. At least about that. Thurgood Marshall, he got to hear Thurgood Marshall, who argued the case on behalf of Herman Sweat, who had been denied admission to the university's law school. Higginbotham would later describe the experience of seeing Marshall. Quote, with controlled outrage, Marshall eloquently asserted the constitutional premise of equality for Sweat, for all African Americans, and it seemed for me personally. Quote, when the court ruled in Sweat's favor, Higginbotham later wrote he felt he had, quote, witnessed the birth of racial justice in the Supreme Court. Oh, I'm going to cry now. He received a Bachelor of Laws from Yale in 1952, and he was the first African-American trustee at Yale University, and one of the first things he did was argue that women be allowed to enter Yale University. I could go on and on about Higginbotham's very illustrious career. He won so many victories for humanity. He was a first so many times. His notable judicial career included being the first African-American United States District Judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and the Chief United States Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeal for the Third Circuit. He organized the first African-American law firm in Philadelphia. He was the first African-American allowed, listen to this language, to argue on behalf of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He served as the president of the Philadelphia NAACP. One of his most consequential legal victories was his right as an African-American jurist to preside over cases dealing with racial injustice. Can you imagine an argument that says, you know, only white people can deal with cases of racial injustice? Well, we're getting to there, unfortunately. Anyway, he was one of the handful of black jurists that President Lyndon Johnson considered to integrate the Supreme Court before he named Thurgood Marshall. And by the way, just in case some of you do not believe elections matter, and shame on you if you do, had Michael Dukakis won the 1988 presidential election, he was planning on appointing Higginbotham to the Supreme Court to take Thurgood Marshall's position. But alas, George Herbert Walker Bush won the election and appointed you-know-who, Clarence Thomas. Elections matter. Register, vote, get out the vote. I say this every time I speak. He was a champion of those marginalized. For example, and this I learned from Michael's wonderful essay, and I'm giving it to the Coretta Scott King Center. He refused to accept any award, no matter how prestigious, if it came from an organization that did not reflect racial, ethnic, religious, and gender pluralism. For example, when the University of Chicago Law School invited him to judge their very prestigious moot court competition, he turned it down because at that time there were no black faculty on the law school and they had not had black faculty for a long time. In 1991, he generated significant public controversy and praise when he wrote an open letter, also going to the Coretta Scott King Center, and I hope you all read it. He wrote an open letter to newly appointed Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, castigating him for taking positions that, in Higginbotham's view, undermined the civil rights movement that had opened the way for Thomas to reach the position for which he was speaking. His first law clerk was Eleanor Holmes, Antioch College, 1960. His clerk for 1986-87 was Sandile Nkobo, who later became the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. He helped Anita Hill And Emma Coleman Jordan published Race, Gender, and Power in America, The Legacy of the Hill-Thomas Hearings in 1995. And Anita Hill considers Leon Higginbotham her mentor, and I'm hoping she may be our next speaker for the series. Maybe Michael can help us. His social activism, see, I'm putting all sorts of pressure on him. His social activism was global. He was involved in the transition to open democratic elections in South Africa. He visited there in 1982 with other black jurists and was appalled at apartheid. He compared it to the former Confederacy after the Civil War. After apartheid's demise, Higginbotham consulted with Nelson Mandela and founded the South African Free Election Fund, SAFE. He raised several $million to support fair elections in South Africa. He was an international mediator of the first interracial elections there. And after the election, he helped South Africa's newly elected government draft their constitution. Nelson Mandela said, quote, "Judge Higginbotham's work and the example he set made a critical contribution to the course of the rule of law in the United States and a difference in the lives of African Americans, and indeed in the lives of all Americans. But his influence crossed borders and inspired many who fought for freedom and equality in other countries. Judge Higginbotham played an important role in South Africa's first democratic election, supported the development of public interest law work in South Africa, and helped create broader opportunities for black South African lawyers," end quote. President Clinton awarded him the highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in 1995. In 1996, the NAACP awarded him its highest honor, the Springer Model. He received the first Spirit of Raoul Wallenberg Humanitarian Award in 1994. And he was awarded this on the basis of his advocacy on behalf of America's children within the legal profession and his human rights efforts in South Africa. There is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights has the annual Leon Higginbotham Corporate Leadership Award. He was awarded honorary degrees from 62 universities, including Antioch, and he served on the Antioch College Board of Trustees from 1983 to 1987. Channeling our own Horace Mann's celebration to win victories for humanity, Higginbotham appealed to the 1996 graduating Wesleyan class. "I make two requests of you, that you always attempt to see those human beings who become invisible to most people, and that you always try to hear the pleas of these persons who, despite their pain and suffering, have become voiceless and forgotten." I first heard about Leon Higginbotham during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. I think he had an op-ed piece in the New York Times. And then more about him during the Clinton impeachment proceedings. And then from our own Francis Deegan Horowitz, who awarded Leon Higginbotham an honorary degree from the CUNY Graduate Center. Once we won back the college, we began to talk about a way to honor Professor Higginbotham. However, saving the college, raising money, bringing in faculty, students, getting accredited, yada-da-da-da-da-da, really postponed our efforts. But now, with President Manley's leadership, we are ready to move forward, and this is part of the gift of the class of 1968. I learned from Michael's article, Speaking Truth to Power, in the Yale Law and Poverty Review, which is also going to the Coretta Scott King Center, and you also should read, that his uncle hoped that someday soon he could sponsor a conference in order to discuss some of these ideas with the many supporters of civil rights throughout the country. He thought that such a gathering could be the touchstone for new strategies and initiatives to create equal opportunity in the new millennium. He imagined a conference similar to the original Niagara Project, which served as the catalyst for the important work of the NAACP. Our seminar cannot replicate the Niagara Conference, but we hope it will be a catalyst for greater involvement in activism, discussions, and to fulfill his dreams and our dreams. Now I get to introduce Michael Higginbotham, and I promise you this will be very brief. I taught at an all-black college, and I do know that quite often the introduction is longer than the speech, so I apologize. And Michael did say I could call him Michael. He is the Joseph Curtis Professor of Law and the former interim dean at the University of Baltimore Baltimore School of Law, and he teaches courses on constitutional law, race, and the law. His book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America, we have it now in the Coretta Scott King Center and in the library, and I've actually read it. It's a great book. It's really important. And he posited that America will never fulfill its potential unless it truly enters a post-racial era and believes that time is of the essence as competition increases globally. He didn't go to Antioch, but he got a pretty good education. He went to Brown University. He had Juris Doctor from Yale University, and then a Master of Laws degree with honors from Cambridge University. Before joining the University of Baltimore Law Faculty in 1988, Professor Higginbotham was a law clerk to United States Court of Appeal Judge Cecil Poole and an associate of Davis Polk and Wardwell and a lecturer of law at the University of Pennsylvania. And along with the Ghosts of Jim Crow, he is the author of Race Law Cases, Commentary, and Questions, a sort of basic textbooks used in all law schools. He has published widely. He's been on NPR. He's been on CNN. And it is more than a pleasure. It's really such a great honor. I'm tickled red to be able to introduce two Higginbothams, and I want to hear a lot from Antioch.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. To President Manley, to members of the college and Yellow Springs communities, to distinguished guests, and to my friends. I am thrilled to be here with you today. There is tremendous warmth in this room, great excitement, nostalgia, and it truly makes me feel good to be here in the presence of all of you. I feel, because of that I need to speak to you from the heart today rather than the head. For an academic who's an activist, it doesn't get any better than this. Reunion weekend, perfect weather, and I'm here at Antioch. I mean, this is abolitionist Horace Mann founded it. It's a place that was based on equality and values education as a part of our democratic process. It can't get much better than that for me, so I'm delighted to be here, and I really feel that this is something that my heart will be the spokesperson rather than my head. I want to thank Dr. Winslow. I want to thank Barbara for the kind introduction and the generous one. My mom would, of course, love you for it. Also want to thank her for all her efforts at bringing this event about today. Leon would appreciate it, as well as the entire Higginbotham family. Also want to thank the class of 1968 for the financial support for this. 1968, a very difficult year for everybody in America, but particularly for an Antioch graduate, Coretta Scott King, whose husband was assassinated that year. The flag was at half-mast way too often, but I'm delighted to see members of the Coretta Scott King Center here today. Also want to thank Suzanne Hashim. Suzanne, appreciate the invitation. It was an easy invitation to accept, but I appreciate your letter extending the invitation to give the inaugural A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., and Barbara, you pronounced that name perfectly, A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Series lecture. And so A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., Uncle Leon, as I called him, he was a man for all seasons, a wise and fair jurist, as you heard Barbara talking about, a zealous and tenacious advocate and lawyer, and a wise and moderate and inspirational advisor. But what set Leon apart, what made him so special, what made him different than many, many others who are smart and who are hardworking, was his compassion, his concern, his unrelenting empathy for those who were less fortunate than he. Leon had a special concern for the poor and for the sick. He had a special concern for the weak and the handicapped. He had a special concern for the homeless and the hopeless. And he had a special concern for those who had been excluded or forgotten. Barbara mentioned that he was involved in the admission of women to Yale College in the late 1960s. Leon was a board member at Yale College, first African American to serve on the board. And he often shared this story about that admission of women, about his involvement in the debate that occurred in the board. It's a very contentious debate and a very divided board. And Leon spoke very forcefully for the admission of women at Yale College and the value that that would provide. And after the vote, and it was a very close vote, but after the vote took place, a gentleman came up to Leon who had been on the opposite side, and he said, "Leon, I'm disappointed in you." He said, "I was a Yale graduate, and this is going to change. This is going to change the college for the worse." He said, "The experience that I had will never be one that students will be able to experience again." And it was a good experience. And Leon said, "Well, I respectfully disagree with you, and I'm glad the vote came out the way it did." But then Leon talks about what happened 5 years later when he gave the commencement address at Yale College. And the same gentleman came up to him after the address, and he said, "Leon, what a wonderful day it is today." He said, "I want you to meet my family." And he introduced his wife and his children. And he said, "And I especially want you to meet my daughter, who's a graduate of Yale College today." Yeah. Leon had a special ability to help people to understand the wrongness of their ways. He had a special ability to bring people together. It was a gift, a unique gift. And I often called it the amazing grace touch. Leon could bring the divided together. He could help people to understand if they were excluding, how wrong that was. If they were oppressing, how wrong that was. And I call it the amazing grace touch after the famous slave ship captain, Bostonian, John Newton, who became an abolitionist, and who wrote that song, Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Leon helped a lot of people to be able to see the light. Leon had that gift. And Barbara talked a little bit about what brought him to Antioch. Leon's gift, Leon's compassion, made him speak truth to power. He did it so often in his life, and he started doing it as a young 16-year-old freshman at Purdue University. And Barbara shared you the story, so I won't go over that again. But I will say this about that occurrence. President Eliot gave the most inspirational speech that you can imagine. Now, I know this is Ohio, right? This is the cradle of coaches, and this is Ohio State Buckeye territory, and people are familiar. Nobody likes the Buckeyes? People are familiar with wonderful inspirational speeches in the locker room. President Eliot gave Leon an inspirational speech. As you heard from Barbara, on that day, Leon said, if the law doesn't require heat for black students in the attic, then something is wrong. And in fact, I'm going to dedicate my life to changing those laws. And that's what he did. So thank you, President Eliot, for inspiring Leon. Leon spoke truth to power, not only at Purdue in the president's office, but Leon spoke truth to power in the corridors of Washington, D.C. Leon spoke truth to power in academic circles at Harvard University. And Leon spoke truth to power in the parliament in South Africa. I will never, ever forget Leon's speaking truth to power to members of the National Party parliament in Pretoria, South Africa in 1986. Leon attended a conference in South Africa during the heart of apartheid. An American delegation was invited over to talk about ways to dismantle apartheid. And this was at the height of apartheid, but also during a period of time in the country where we were involved in a constructive engagement policy with the oppressive government, the apartheid government in South Africa. President Reagan initiated this constructive engagement policy where he basically said, South Africa is our friend, they're opposed to communism, and so therefore we need to engage with them in a constructive way. And so we worked with South Africa in many ways, but protests occurred in the United States. Many protests, some of you may have been involved with them. I was involved with them, taking over, putting up shanty towns at universities, asking for divestment of university portfolios, supporting the apartheid regime. And so I had the opportunity to accompany Leon with this American delegation. And as the government wasn't too happy about it, South African government, but as part of this constructive engagement policy, they said they would engage with the American delegation. So National Party members of Parliament invited the American delegation to come and have a sit down, and I had an opportunity to witness that. And several members of the National Party got up and they began to speak about apartheid and how blacks and whites were different from one another, and how apartheid was justifiable, and how it worked for everyone, benefited both blacks and whites. The Americans, there was strain on the American faces as they were listening to this, but when the delegates from the National Party sat down, all the Americans looked at Leon for a response, even though Leon was not the leader of the American delegation. And when Leon got up to speak, I started looking for the exit doors because I knew that this may be a little difficult to get out of there. Leon began by talking about the similarities of human beings and how everyone has a desire for food and shelter and value of education and family. And then he began to talk about the incidents in world history where people could not come together and the devastation of those incidents. And then he began to talk about examples of people being unified and people being able to make a difference in the lives of those around them. And then he concluded, not with the statements of a lawyer, but he concluded with the statements of a playwright. He concluded with Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice, a character from the Merchant of Venice called Shylock. And what he said was, in the words of Shylock, "Am I not like you? If you tickle me, will I not laugh? If you pinch me, will I not hurt? And if you stab me, will I not bleed?" Leon said, "The lessons I learned from you today, I will better the instruction tomorrow." And then he sat down and led the delegation out. And I was never so happy to get out of a place. And I wasn't sure if they were going to take us to Jan Smuts Airport or Robben Island with a cell next to Mandela, but I was never so proud of my uncle when he stood up. You said, Barbara, some nice things that Nelson Mandela had said, and I suspect that Mandela was told a great deal about that meeting and the things that Leon subsequently did to assist in the dismantling of apartheid. This was who Judge Higginbotham was. Judge Higginbotham was an individual that I like to say had the 3 C's: character, commitment, courage. And he demonstrated those 3 C's on many occasions to the benefit, I think, of all Americans. Now, that said, let me speak to you for the remainder of this session in the spirit of those 3 C's. Because I know you folks are here for the reunion. I know you folks are here to have a good weekend, get some good drink and food, and reminisce about the good old times, and rekindle some friendships, and maybe even some lost loves. So I know that the reunions can be a good thing. But candidly, I've got to answer to 2 other people today. I got to answer to Leon, who's looking down, and I got to answer to Thurgood Marshall, who's also looking down, and who said to me as a first-year law student when I was at Yale in 1980, he came in, made a wonderful speech about his involvement in Brown versus Board of Education and all the cases that he had done on the Supreme Court. And then he said, "I'm going to give you a few final words." He said, "The most important thing I'm going to say to you today is, as a lawyer," he said, "you may not get the microphone. But if you're fortunate enough ever to get the microphone, you better use it well. You better toot the right message." And that's a quote. You better toot the right message. So, Justice Marshall, if you're listening, I got the microphone. And so I'm going to toot the message because I remember what you said. Let me first say to you that I'm delighted to see so many of you here. And that's because it's not going to be easy. And I know some of you listen to speeches like this and understand that it's not going to be easy. President Theodore Roosevelt once said, "The credit belongs to those who enter the arena rather than to those timid souls that know neither victory nor defeat." It's not easy to talk about race in America today, particularly when you do it across racial lines. You folks of all colors, you folks deserve some credit because of your willingness to come out and to engage and to get involved in the arena, which is a potentially divisive one. Let me start by reminding you of our history, our difficult history. And look, I know a lot of you don't need a reminder. especially those Antioch graduates, are well familiar with that history. And as I heard last night with the class of '68, many of you were involved in the civil rights movement and in the protests that occurred, and took some great risks to life and limb. The history is a difficult one. During 1965, you had peaceful protests that were going on in terms of voting, getting people registered and getting them the right to participate in our democratic process. Those peaceful voters were, peaceful protesters were beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, came on, made a national TV speech. And he said, their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just American Negroes, but it's all of us that must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and prejudice in our society. And then he closed, of course, by adopting the words of the civil rights community by saying, and we shall overcome. Now, in my judgment, President Johnson was right. We shall overcome, we must overcome, we will overcome, and as a nation, in many respects, we have overcome. We've ended slavery, we've ended Jim Crow segregation, we passed anti-discrimination laws in housing, public accommodations, in voting. We have passed legislation and also implemented affirmative action programs in employment and education. And most recently, we've elected and re-elected our first black president. Now, in my view, these are monumental stages of progress. America, my country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. America has made tremendous progress. We all need to recognize that. But guess what, folks? Progress does not mean post-racial. I know you know it. Progress does not mean that race is no longer a significant factor in opportunities afforded or hardships endured in our society today. And everybody needs to recognize that. Now, tremendous racial disparities exist. National statistics, today, national statistics document widespread disparities in every category on the socioeconomic index, from birth to death, every category. Huge disparities, almost as broad as existed during Jim Crow. I know some of you find it hard to believe, but the disparities are widespread and getting wider. Let me just give you one example of a disparity. Wealth accumulation today between black families and white families, 18-to-1 differential. Now, a lot of people say it's got to be wrong. When I was doing my book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, I was like, we got to be sure that that's correct. So I had some research assistants. I said, I need 3 sites, not 2, 3 sites on this one. And candidly, it's correct. 18-to-1 differential. During apartheid in South Africa, when I was over there in 1986, the differential of wealth accumulation between black and white families was less than 18-to-1. That's what we have in America today. It stayed the same under Clinton, under Obama, under Bush. There was no change. And so these disparities are widespread and alarming. Now, everyone agrees that these statistics are accurate. Now, you know what folks say about statistics. There's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics, right? Everyone agrees that these statistics are accurate. They disagree, though. They disagree as to the cause. Conservatives tend to rely on personal responsibility aspects. And they make arguments that dealing with racial stereotypes and cultural and intellectual deficiencies and moral deficiencies of blacks and other racial minorities. Ignoring or minimizing the impact, the effect that the law has had on creating these disparities and on maintaining them. Now, I know this is Antioch, and I can't get away with just making statements. So I know you folks want some examples. Got plenty of them in Ghosts of Jim Crow, but let me just give you one example of a misguided law that is responsible for maintaining disparities that exist today. 2013 decision of the United States Supreme Court called Shelby County versus Holder. And this decision struck down a portion of the Voting Rights Act, the 1965 piece of legislation that is the most democratizing piece of legislation we've ever passed in this country. At its passage, 6% of African Americans in Mississippi were able to vote. After its passage, 4 years later, over 66% of African Americans participated in the electoral process in Mississippi. So, this piece of legislation, the coverage formula that says what states and what jurisdictions will be supervised by the federal government, what states and jurisdictions have a history of race discrimination in the electoral process and therefore must be supervised. Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, Shelby County in Alabama challenges the Voting Rights Act. They basically say that the formula is outdated and that Shelby County and other jurisdictions in Alabama, as well as throughout the country, should no longer have to be supervised by the federal government. Goes up to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision in 2013, says, you're right, Shelby County. We strike down the coverage formula because it is outdated. Now, I got 3 problems with this decision. 3 levels. First, it's wrong on the law. The majority is wrong on the law. Supreme Court has always said they give deference, appropriate deference, to a co-equal branch of government. In 2011, Congress got together and Congress held hearings on whether or not to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Now, you can't get 2 congressmen to agree in the same room that the sky is blue. But in 2011, 99 senators, and the other one didn't show up, 99 senators voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Over 330 members of the House of Representatives voted to reauthorize the act. They held hearings. You had testimony, people coming in talking about discrimination still occurring. And so Congress reauthorized the act, said we need it for another 25 years. United States Supreme Court, 5 justices, they didn't give appropriate deference to a determination by Congress that this is still needed and that the formula still makes sense. Second, it's disrespectful. It's disrespectful to Americans of all colors who protested peacefully to help secure the right to participate in the democratic process and who were beaten. People like Congressman John Lewis, who were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. People like Viola Luisa, a white woman from Detroit, a mother of 5 children, who heeded Dr. King's call that people from the North need to come down and help us. And she got in her car and drove down to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Her job was to shuttle people to and from the airport, protesters. And she was murdered. And to me, this case is disrespectful to her memory and the memory of many others who, in some cases, died so that others would have the right to vote. Third, and most importantly, though, this case reflects what I call the Bush versus Gore problem. This case undermines the respect that Americans have for the least dangerous branch. It undermines the court's objectivity. The judges are supposed to interpret the law. And when you look at this decision, 5-4 decision, you had 5 justices appointed by Republican presidents strike the Voting Rights Act down. You had 4 appointed by Democrats saying there's nothing wrong with the Voting Rights Act, it's still needed, there's nothing wrong with the coverage formula. Maybe it needs to be expanded a little bit. Now, I'm going to be very candid with you. I'm going to tell you what I think about 5 justices in the majority in this case. And my mother, who 93 years old, and bless her soul, she's doing well. She always gets scared when I go off script and I say, hey, I'm going to be candid and talk to the people. She always gets worried. She said, oh, you're going to get fired, and, you know, I'm a little scared you're going to have to move back in with us. So I tell you, Mom is amazing. I had to sit her down 3 years ago. I was crazy, but I took her to an LMFAO concert. I don't know if any of you folks are familiar with that group. But we were sitting in the front row, and they called the front row up on stage. I'm doing like this, and before I noticed, Mom is walking up the steps. So she gets on stage dancing to I'm Sexy and I Know It. It's LMFAO, right? Sexy and I Know It. So I had to sit her down, and I say, hey, Mom, you're 90 now, and it's time to slow down a little taste, right? But she's still going strong, 93. And she said, you got to be real careful about what you say. And I said, you know what, Mom? I got a beautiful thing. It's called tenure. And that means I can say exactly what I feel, exactly what I believe in my heart, and I can't be fired for it. So here goes, folks. 5 justices on the Supreme Court suffer from a rare disease. They suffer from what is known as selective memory loss. It occurs most often when people owe you money, right? They borrow money from you, you got it, and they can remember who won the 1916 World Series, but they can't remember come payday that they owe you some money and that money is due. 5 Supreme Court justices suffer from that same rare disease because they can't seem to remember that we had poll taxes, we had literacy tests, we had grandfather clauses in this country that stopped people from being able to exercise their vote. They weren't race-based. They didn't say blacks can't vote, Latinos can't vote, but they had the exact same impact, and everybody knows what the intent was. Now, what's going on today? As soon as this decision came down, 20 states instituted restrictive voter ID laws. 20 states. Because you know what? The states knew they didn't have to go to the federal government to get permission to change their voting practices. Why? Because the coverage formula was struck down. No one is now covered under the Voting Rights Act. So I would say to these justices, we can debate whether the intent of restrictive voter ID laws or limitations on same-day registration or limitations on early voting, we can debate whether or not the same intent is present with respect to grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes. We can debate that. And candidly, I can submit a whole lot of evidence and emails between legislators that say exactly, look, we know why we're passing these voter ID laws. Because most blacks are registered as Democrats. And it's going to disproportionately limit their participation. And oh, by the way, many young people are also registered as Democrats, and it's going to have a disproportionate impact on them. And by the way, many senior citizens are also registered, and it's going to have a disproportionate impact on them. So we can talk about whether the intent is exactly the same, but guess what? We don't need to debate the statistics on this one either, because the results are exactly the same. A disproportionate impact on various groups, such as students, such as the elderly, such as the handicapped, and racial minorities. And everybody knows it, except 5 justices on the Supreme Court. Now, folks, we've got a Supreme Court nomination. Supreme Court nomination that has been made. This is why the Supreme Court is so important. It's because most of the critical civil rights decisions are 5-4. Most of these decisions are 5-4. And this appointment is different from the Scalia Gorsuch appointment. And here's why it's different. Scalia was in the conservative 4 justices. So you had a 4-4-1 situation with Kennedy taking Justice O'Connor's position as the swing vote. So when you have a civil rights case, you had to look at what Kennedy thought to figure out what was going to happen. And Kennedy is generally a conservative, but he was a moderate on a number of civil rights issues. The difference with this appointment than Scalia is that Kennedy was the swing. And so now if you have a replacement to Justice Kennedy who is a conservative and not a swing vote in any way, you are seriously going to send the court to the right very, very far. Because these decisions are now going to be 5-4 in almost every civil rights case. And that is against the plaintiffs challenging disproportionate laws. And so that's why this is so important for you to remember. One other thing. It's important to talk about the court, but it's also important to talk about the president. I'm not going to talk about him much, but I will say this, that it's very important, whether you're Democrat, Republican, whether you're black or white, it's very important when you disagree with the president, it's very important to go on record publicly. If you watch CNN, if you watch Don Lemon on CNN at night, you'll know that I have no problem going on record publicly when I disagree with the president. That has been very often these days, particularly on issues of race. Now, the president has said some very divisive things. When he said them, I went on record publicly disagreeing with him. I wrote a lot of op-ed pieces. I was on CNN talking about him. Whether it be the Muslim ban, whether it be Mexican immigrants, calling them rapists, whether it be indicating that there are some good neo-Nazis and good Klansmen, or indicating that separating children on the border should be American policy. I went on record disagreeing with him, but I'm going to say this. Those were some very divisive things. But the worst thing the president has said, and I think a lot of people are going to be surprised, the worst thing to me that the president has said is when he said that he didn't like John McCain because John McCain is a loser because he was in battle in Vietnam and got captured in combat. So therefore, I don't like losers. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I wasn't in the military, but both my dad and one of my uncles were. They were Tuskegee Airmen, black pilots during World War II. You had 1,000 of them, and they volunteered for military service. I've got a flag given to me by a respectful country for my uncle. My dad's still living. My uncle passed away last year at 95. And I got a flag on my mantle at home from a respectful country. So I say this to you because I'm a person who respects the flag. And we can have a nice debate on what I think about President Trump and what he did with the NFL. But I can tell you this, President Trump, when he said that John McCain is a loser because he is an American who in battle got captured, when this guy had deferments and avoided going into the draft, I got a real serious problem with anybody who says, I like our military and I believe in America, but who would vote or continue to support this president, just on that statement alone. Now, we can talk about anything else you want, and I'm happy to answer some questions later. But let me just finish up real quick. And I was told to talk for about 40 minutes, so I'm going to finish up in 39 minutes. I wrote a book called Ghosts of Jim Crow. It's about how far we've come as a nation and also how far we still need to go on racial equality. The book talks about 3 pillars of Jim Crow: segregation, victimization, and supremacy. And we need to destroy those pillars. And the book talks about ways that we can destroy those pillars. That's the thing I'm most proud about. I can criticize America all I want, but also need to come up with a way to do things better. And in the book, I suggest ways that we can do that. But something happened to me after I published the book. I wrote an op-ed. It's called Ghosts of Jim Crow Continue to Haunt. And it was published in the Baltimore Sun. And the op-ed gave 3 examples of why I believe we still have ghosts of Jim Crow living in our society today. And one of the examples I used was a Valley Swim Club in suburban Philadelphia, where an inner city day camp that didn't have a pool, and it was predominantly black children that were in this summer day camp. They cut a deal with the Valley Swim Club in suburban Philly and for the kids to come out for a month and swim. First day the kids get there, about 15 black kids, they get there. The manager of the pool says, you got to get out of the water, leads the kids out, and Marcus Allen, 9-year-old Marcus Allen, is let out in tears. Next day, the spokesperson for the Valley Swim Club says we had to cancel that contract because, and I quote, it would change the complexion of our facility. That's a quote, all right? So this is an example I put in the editorial. So you know how editorials are also published hard copy, but they're also published online. So this was published online, and so I go online to see the comments. Now, my students say, hey, professor, that's your first mistake. You're not supposed to go online and look at the comments. So I go online, look at the comments. First 4 or 5 are innocuous stuff. You know, people got their own agendas. And the 5th comment was like, this professor needs to be fired from the University of Baltimore. This professor has the audacity to make up examples when they can't prove their arguments by real concrete stuff. They made this stuff up. This person said, I called the Valley Swim Club. They never heard of this fellow. And they never heard of this incident. And so I would say that the University of Baltimore needs to really get some better hiring practices, and the first thing they need to do is dismiss this professor. So I'm getting a little hot, reading this thing. But, they say, hey, if you're the author, you just, got to hold your powder and hold back. So I said, fine, okay. So I'm watching, and a couple other comments come in. I played a little football back in my day, and I would call this piling on. It's when you tackle the running back, and then a couple of defenders say, hey, he's down, but we're going to hit him a little extra so he doesn't get up so fast. So piling on. People said, I knew these examples looked a little fishy. And now I'm convinced, these aren't facts, and the professor shouldn't be making this stuff up, and he's a terrible person, and his argument is weak because these examples are lies. So I'm waiting and waiting. 3 days go by. Nothing. It's just piling on, piling on. And then it happens. Somebody wrote in and they said, I read the professor's book, read the op-ed, and I also read the professor's book. He has over 600 endnotes in the book. These 3 examples that he provided, including the Valley Swim Club example, are all well documented in the book. These were well researched, and they were covered in the media and such well-known publications as the New York Times and the Washington Post documented these incidents. And so I am a little disappointed that you folks thought the professor made this stuff up, because all of the examples are real. They're well documented. And then the person says, and by the way, the person who wrote in first and called the Valley Swim Club, you actually called the Valley Swim Club in suburban Baltimore, whereas the article says it's the Valley Swim Club in suburban Philadelphia. And then the person said, I think that that's all that needs to be said at this time. Now, I started watching very closely after that. And what happened is the most disappointing thing for me. Now, some people, including my mom, say, well, you're a little naive. But I didn't expect an apology. I'm not that naive. I didn't expect an apology. But what I did expect was something different than occurred. And do you know what occurred? Nothing. Nobody said one word. What I expected was, Professor, okay, these are true, but that still doesn't mean they're ghosts of Jim Crow. These are all about economics. It's not about race. It's about the green. Or say something, that, hey, I got some arguments that it has nothing to do with race. It has to do with something else. Silence was the most disturbing thing to me, because I wrote this book not to end the conversation, but to continue it. And so I will conclude today by telling you that it's unacceptable to remain silent. It's unacceptable to remain silent when political leaders equate the moral equivalency of the NAACP and the Ku Klux Klan. It's unacceptable, right? Yeah. Unacceptable to remain silent when the president orders separation of children for asylum seekers, separation of children from their parents for asylum seekers on the border. It's unacceptable. And it's unacceptable to remain silent when 9 African American churchgoers are murdered by a white supremacist while they are worshiping. It's unacceptable to remain silent. So I will end by quoting Judge Higginbotham's favorite poem. It was written by Langston Hughes in 1963 for the Civil Rights Movement. It is a poem whose words are just as relevant and inspirational today with what we are going through, just as they were in 1963 when Langston Hughes wrote them. These words are especially for Supreme Court Justice-elect, Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh. This dream today embattled with its back against the wall, to save the dream for one, it must be saved for all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes, maybe 25 minutes to take some questions. I'm going to try to do my best to be fair in the distribution. I believe we have a couple of people, Suzanne, who have mics on the floor. Here's David. So the first question Nancy is helping to direct will be on this side.
Professor, do you have any strategies to suggest for dealing with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh?
Very, very timely and important question. I think that people should definitely, the strategy is a simple one. Delay, delay, delay. And let's see what happens in November. Under our constitutional democracy, the Senate has a role to play. It's advise and consent. And so I would encourage all of you to contact your senators, to support your civil rights groups that are in opposition to the nomination, to provide them not only with moral support, but economic support as well. Because it's going to be critical for our United States senators to take seriously their advise and consent role. Now, candidly, the delay tactic is probably the best that those who are very concerned about the direction of the court, it's probably the best that you can expect because of the raw numbers. Mitch McConnell has already declared victory with the horrendous thing that was done by Mitch and other senators in the Republican Party by not having a hearing on Judge Garland. And I saw that Senator Schumer, leader of the Democrats, one of the first things he said was Senator McConnell is hypocritical in that his position is different from the Scalia-Gorsuch hearings. Senator McConnell said, and this is what professors do, Senator McConnell said, no, this is different because delay is only appropriate in a presidential election year. So I would encourage the strategy of a delay tactic, see what happens in November. But candidly, if you saw the rollout of Brett Kavanaugh, very difficult to defeat a nominee when you don't have a majority in the Senate. Very difficult to defeat a nominee with his credentials and with the way he comes off in the media. And the reason why I say that is if you look at Judge Bork, who was defeated, and what much of this goes back to in terms of controversial Supreme Court nominations and hearings, Judge Bork was a professor of mine actually at Yale. Judge Bork doesn't come off well on TV and in the media. And so one of the ways that Bork was able to be defeated is because people looked at him and they said, this guy seems to be way out there, just in the way he looked. Now, it's a shame that that's what happens in America and in our political arena. But if you looked at the rollout, Judge Kavanaugh did not come off as Judge Bork. And so, you know, giving you my crystal ball, I say it's going to be a very difficult process, but hope for a delay and perhaps for lightning to strike in November.
I wanted to say that was an excellent way to ask a question. I forgot to mention at the beginning, I'm sorry, if we can have questions and not long statements first. Okay, who's next, Nancy? Okay, thank you.
I have a question on a personal level. I live in a rural area. I live in a house by myself, and I have neighbors who are very, very conservative. Not all of them, but the closest neighbors, very conservative. They're very pleasant people. When the power goes out, they come over, are you okay? Things like this. I value their friendship. But they are major Trump supporters. They support, they have guns. They have all sorts of things that I just totally disagree with. And I wondered if you could just give some words of wisdom for how to deal with this. Sure. I mean, I try very hard to maintain a good relationship with them, and yet I need them to know that I respectfully disagree.
Sure, sure. And I think your question is not only an excellent one, but I really like the way you laid it out. I really liked your sentiment. I think you really have answered the question for me, but you know, let me earn my salary here and you know, say a few additional aspects. I grew up in integrated environments all my life. And if you read my book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, I talk about it in the preface. There's a really important lesson that people learn when they grow up in integrated environments. And I'm saying integrated in the sense of racial, but also in the sense of diversity, whether it be your political affiliation, whether it be your philosophy. Diversity to me is a valuable tool because the lesson that I learned in these integrated environments is a simple one, but it's a lesson that far too few Americans learn today. And that is that good people come in all colors, and that bad people come in all colors. Smart people come in all colors, and dumb people come in all colors. And you learn it. It's such a simple lesson, I'm telling you. You learn it because you see it on a daily basis. And so I think there's something of value in that because, yes, you live in a diverse community in terms of people's political affiliation and in terms of their philosophy. Now, to me, there's nothing wrong with being a conservative or a liberal. There's nothing wrong with being a moderate or a Green Party member. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me, what's wrong with it is if your values are misplaced. So to me, it's not about race. It's not about political affiliation. It's about values. Values that were demonstrated by Langston Hughes's words. And so to me, I listen to some of the conservatives today, and I tell you, I'm getting a lot of respect for a few conservatives that are willing to stand up to the president. And that, to me, that is the problem. When you disagree, how can you be silent? And honestly, I listened to some of the analysis on evangelicals. And it's very, very disturbing to me that people would say, and this came up with recently with the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. They said, well, evangelicals really support the president, and they do so, they don't care what else he does as long as he gives them Supreme Court justices who are conservative and who are going to overturn abortion. If you have values, you need to be consistent. And so when people say, you know what, I believe in life. Abortion is wrong, period. Don't give me any exceptions. You understand what I'm saying? Don't give me the exception for rape or for some sort of physical ailment. Life, you believe in it. To me, that's consistent. But then don't turn around and say, but I'm for the death penalty. And so what I would encourage you to do is to sit down with your neighbors and to, just in that same spirit that you delivered this question, to sit down with them and say, you know what, you're my neighbor, I respect you, but I respectfully disagree with you on this point. And we have a lot in common. Talk about what you have in common first, because candidly, I don't want them to tune you out. And sometimes folks will tune you out. So tell them what you have in common and how you respect this and this and this, and then tell them, but look, I disagree with you on this, and be very clear and adamant. I had to sit down with, and I was sharing this earlier, I had to sit down over the holidays. My brother had a roommate from law school, and he and his wife joined us for the holidays. And he's a white fellow who went to Howard Law School, a historically black college, law school in D.C., and who voted for Obama twice. And he and his wife both said after we had Christmas dinner and over discussions of politics, they both said, look, I got to be honest with you, we voted for Trump. And I kept my mouth shut. You know, I didn't want to mess up the holidays and stuff, so I kept my mouth shut pretty much. But then they said, hey, look, Mike, you know, we know you write a lot and go on CNN a lot, and what do you think? And I said, look, I tell you, I was diplomatic. This is what I want you to do with your neighbors. I said, you know what? I said, I am deeply disappointed to hear that you voted for Trump. You are good people, and I know this. And I know you have good hearts, and I know your hearts are in the right place. I said, but it's hard for me to understand how you could have voted for Trump, knowing what was said during the election, during the campaign, knowing what he said, and knowing how it impacted Americans that you care about, how many minorities are afraid now in this country because of being physically harmed or being wrongfully detained, and how President Trump seems to be very divisive on this. And we don't even need to go into what he said on the video about males grabbing females' personal parts without permission. So I said, I don't understand how you could vote for someone. You may have a lot of problems with Hillary Clinton, but I don't see how you could vote for someone who is so divisive in terms of how your fellow countrymen view that person. And the response I got really opened up my eyes, because I really don't have that opportunity to sit down with individuals who are Trump supporters. Look, in my classes, you would think that you would get some diversity in the classes. I can tell you this. In the non-required classes, right, self-selected, I get very few Trump supporters. And in the mandatory classes, candidly, no one stands up and says, you know, I like Trump and here's why. And I encourage people to do so, but folks tend not to. It's not Antioch, you know, that folks won't stand up and say what they really believe sometimes. But here's the thing. The response was, I said to her, you know, I wrote all these editorials she said, I don't think President Trump is a racist. And I said, I wrote all these editorials. I went on television, on CNN, talking about this. You must have seen me on Don Lemon at least one time. And the response was eye-opening. The response was, I don't watch CNN. I only watch Fox. We are in a divided nation where the information that people get is so colored. I mean, it is, you're in either one world or the other world. And so it was understandable to me after I heard that, how if you only watch Fox, you're going to get a very different view of President Trump than you would if you watch Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and a few others. And so I would encourage you when you sit down with your neighbors to be well-read, to have the Judge Higginbotham approach when he walked into President Elliott's office, very deferential, saying, you know, Mr. President, would it be okay? Would it be too much to ask if I could just have a little heat in the attic in December? I would do that approach, and who knows? Who knows? I will await the response that you get after that discussion. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
This isn't a question, this is actually an observation. I'm Anna Hoogerty, former Antioch College staff, daughter of former co-op faculty Bud Hoogerty. Very happy to hear you speak today. I actually knew your uncle for a brief period of time when he gave the Founders Day address in October of, I think it was 1980. The one thing that has not been mentioned by anyone reflecting on your uncle was his incredible voice. You could not help but listen to what this man had to say because he had such an engaging, charismatic, heartful voice. And I think that in conjunction with his experience at Purdue that brought him here, that helped him grow and mature to be the person that some of us had the pleasure of knowing, some of the people had the pleasure of being in the family. I just wanted to make that comment that actually was an experience to sit in the audience and have him stand up there and speak. And you couldn't help but want to absorb what that man had to say. Thank you very much.
Well said. Very well said. I would just add that my mom said that you didn't get his height, you didn't get his deep baritone voice, but you got some of his brains.
I respectfully disagree. I think you've got his voice as well. I haven't heard his voice, but I would listen to you. Keep on going. I just appreciated your talk so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. This is another comment, not a question. I want to bring together the comments that Barbara made as she was introducing you with yours, which is it's unacceptable to be silent. And our voice now, more than ever, needs to be a vote. And for those of us who live in the colony of Washington, D.C., and we don't have any voting representation, it's a little difficult to call my senator since I don't have one. But I do think that Barbara's comment about now more than ever is so consistent with yours, that now more than ever, we have to vote, we have to, I'm not telling you who to vote for, this is a C3 statement, but just that it's important to know the candidates and vote. And I agree, your voice is great, and I was spellbound. Everything you said is so important. You could have been an Antiochian. Let me just say to that comment,
you will actually love my book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, because one of the things that I say in terms of solutions is empowering politically, economically, and educationally, empowering our minority communities. And one of the ways that we can do that is through legislation, particularly legislation allowing for the District of Columbia to be a full participant in our democratic process. And Puerto Rico, very good, very good.
No? I think we have a hand over here, to my right.
Very good.
Hi. So I have a question about state legislatures and the number of Republican governors we have. Yeah. Why? Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Okay, my name is Joanne Simon. And I'm a state legislator in Brooklyn, New York. And I represent Barbara Winslow in particular. Thank you, Barbara. We are perilously close to being able to have a constitutional convention and literally change everything, not just the de facto, but de jure. I'm curious what your thinking is about those prospects and what your thinking is about the prospects of us recapturing enough state houses to keep that from happening. I mean, I was glad to see Ben Jealous was successful in his primary. I hope he's successful in the general.
It's going to be a tough race.
But that's,
we'll
yeah,
see.
exactly. That's Maryland. That's not some of these other states. So that's my question.
Mm-hmm. I was talking to somebody this morning about what you were asking. And as a constitutional law professor, I tell people that numbers are very instrumental in the Constitution. And when you see supermajority numbers, you know that it is very difficult to make change. And so when you're talking about constitutional convention nationally, when you're talking about amending the Constitution, it requires supermajority numbers, and therefore it's very difficult. We haven't done it that often in the United States. That said, difficult numbers can be overcome. And that's why coalitions are so important. It's why it's so important to build coalitions across divided lines. Because when you get people together, when you have the super numbers, you can make a huge change in this country. And so for me, what I would say is a constitutional convention would be an excellent idea. We need to have one. I'll be very supportive of it. And there's a whole lot of things that need to be changed in our Constitution. A lot of people look at some of the things in the Constitution and they're like, is that still in the Constitution? Sure, people are talking about the Electoral College these days, and yes, we have a president that didn't win a majority of the popular vote. It's happened before. But we also have some things that are in the Constitution. We have dual citizenship. People don't understand that. When you become an American citizen, right, you're entitled to every protection that other American citizens are entitled to, except for one provision, which a lot of people say it's outdated, needs to be changed. And that, of course, is you have to be a citizen born in the United States to run for president. You want to talk about outdated notions. I mean, that was put in there because there was concern about somebody born in England running for president. Now, there are a number of things. That's just one example, but there are a whole lot of things in the Constitution. If you have a constitutional convention, you might want to change. And so I think it's a great idea. As a con law professor, I would be looking forward to it because my stock would go up. My value would be, of course, increased. But I will also caution you in that there are a lot of good things in our Constitution. And when you open it up, there are a lot of things that you say, hey, we want to keep. And there are a lot of things that have done great service and great value. Separation of powers principle, very important. You know, if you don't like the president today, a lot of you may say, hey, I'm glad we have separation of powers principle. Because yes, the president has a whole lot of authority, but there are checks and balances. And the legislative branch and the judicial branch have checks and balances. Very important notion in our society. Also, of course, freedom of the press. I know there's a lot of denigration by our executive branch member with respect to the press. I, for one, am delighted that we have a free press. I've always been delighted no matter who's in the office. If you look at Obama, if you look at Clinton, they had rough relations with the press as well. Most presidents despise the press. And so I'm glad we have a free press. It's a very important part, the fourth branch of our government, a very important part, and I think it's wonderful that we do. One final thing that I would say to you, we oftentimes don't appreciate the wonderful things that we do have in our Constitution. And I look at it as my job as to remind Americans, you know, just how fortunate we are. And a lot of times we look at the negative and we don't look at the positive. But there's a lot of great things about our Constitution. There's a lot of good things that the founders had right. A lot of things they had wrong, of course, but there's a lot of good things that they had right. It's lasted for a long time. You know, Justice Marshall talked about the original Constitution being defective from the start, and I agree with him. Yes, it was. We corrected that in many respects. The final thing I will say to you, a lot of controversy about the Supreme Court making decisions that are viewed as legislating from the bench, are viewed as changing the Constitution without going through the amendment process. And that is a very controversial area. President George H.W. Bush said in a debate with, was it Mondale? Dukakis, okay. H.W. said in the debate with Dukakis, he said, I am against the Dred Scott decision. And I was watching this debate. Dred Scott decision was an 1857 decision by the Supreme Court, the worst decision ever by the Supreme Court, which basically said blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. It basically said we don't care whether Dred Scott is a slave or whether he's free. He has no rights under the Constitution, even if he's free. And H.W. said, I disagree with the Dred Scott decision. And I was like, what is he talking about? Why is he talking about Dred Scott decision in a debate, right, in the 1980s? What it goes to is implied fundamental rights. And if you look at the most controversial implied fundamental right, it's abortion. And so what George W. Bush was saying is, H.W. was saying is, the Dred Scott decision authorized the Supreme Court to deal with implied fundamental rights. It authorized justices to look at how the Constitution is interpreted and to look at various clauses in the Constitution and to say, well, that's not expressly stated, but it's implied from the language in the Constitution. Now, what Dred Scott decision basically said was that Congress can't strike down the Missouri Compromise. They don't have the power to do that. The Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because you're taking property from slave owners without due process of law. Now, what has happened is that due process clause results in the Supreme Court saying, oh, you have a right to an abortion. Because there's a right of privacy implied in language of the Due Process Clause and others that gives you a right to privacy. And the right to privacy authorizes abortion protection. So Bush was saying, I'm against judges being able to say there's a right to privacy in the Constitution. Now, this is I'm being a constitutional law professor up here, but you want to understand that that's the way the Constitution can provide additional rights to people without going through this amendment process. And so it's very important to have a Supreme Court, as Judge Higginbotham would tell you, that interprets the Constitution as a living, breathing document rather than based on original intent, as Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, and a few other conservative justices do so.
We are actually out of time. We have a couple of announcements. Please refer to your program booklet for the location of your Decades receptions. I also wanted to say, in the spirit of this discussion about voting and the freedom to vote, we're having our first Freedom to Vote rally on the afternoon of September the 23rd. For those of you who are local, or even those of you who come back, we would love to have you. It's on the afternoon of September 23rd. You'll hear more information. But Catherine, we are finally able to get William Barber as our keynote speaker in September for that rally. So we're very excited. But let's give Dr. Higginbotham another round of applause, and thank you so much for being here with us at Antioch. And Tom has one other announcement.
So, Professor Higginbotham, thank you for this book. This will go in the library, so all of you can come and read it. But we also, since you don't go away yet, since you, I think it was Karen who said, you're almost an Antiochian. So this is a long process to become an Antiochian. So this may take 20 years at least, but this is the beginning. So here's an official 50-year reunion T-shirt. And the next time I see you eating crab cakes in Baltimore, we'll both wear those shirts. Okay, thank you.